The sky over southeastern Australia is low and unmoving, a heavy winter ceiling pressed down over the inland hills. It is the morning of the 13th of August, 1940. Canberra is still a young capital, quiet, administrative, carved into open country rather than built upon it. Beyond the city's formal avenues, the land rises sharply. Forested ridgelines encircle the basin, invisible today behind cloud and mist. An aircraft is approaching from the north. It is a Lockheed Hudson, descending steadily, engine set for approach power. Inside the cockpit, there is no sense of emergency. The aircraft is under control. Airspeed is stable. The descent rate is modest. Nothing about the flight suggests imminent danger. Outside, however, the horizon has vanished. Cloud hangs low across the hills west of the city, flattening depth and erasing distance. Visibility shifts minute by minute, clear for seconds, then opaque again. In 1940, there is no precision guidance to lead an aircraft safely through this final descent. No glide slope, no terrain warning, only basic radio aids, charts, experience, and judgment. The Hudson continues downward. The crew is searching for visual reference. Any break in the cloud, any sign of ground features a confirmed position and height. The landscape beneath them is rising faster than the aircraft is descending. This is terrain that demands respect, especially in poor weather. On clear days, it is obvious. On days like this, it is deceptive. The aircraft passes through cloud layers unevenly. Visibility opens briefly, then closes again. Hills appear, then dissolve. The cockpit instruments provide altitude above sea level, not distance from the ground below. In this region, that distinction matters. The descent continues. There is no abrupt maneuver, no sudden power change, no alarm. The aircraft remains flown deliberately, professionally, within the norms of the time. Yet the margins are narrowing with every second. At this moment, no one aboard knows how little space remains between the Hudson and the terrain ahead. There is no indication, no warning system, no clear visual cue that the approach has drifted into danger. The aircraft is still flying. Seconds later, it is not. The impact is violent but brief. The sound does not carry far in the mist. Wreckage scatters across a wooded hillside just outside Canberra, partially obscured by cloud and rain. Fire follows, then silence. Only after the crash will the significance of this flight become fully clear. Only then will Australia understand that this was not merely an aircraft accident, but a national catastrophe, one that unfolded quietly, methodically, and without spectacle. 5 men are dead. Among them are some of the most senior figures in the Australian government. At a moment when the nation is already under the strain of global war, the loss is immediate and profound. But in these opening minutes, before investigations, before headlines, before history assigns meaning, the accident is defined by something simpler and more enduring: an aircraft descending through weather toward terrain it cannot see, with tools that cannot warn it in time. This is the Canberra Air Disaster. In August 1940, Australia is a nation at war, though the fighting is far away. The Second World War has entered its second year, and while the European front dominates headlines, the consequences are already reshaping Australian policy, industry, and governance. Decisions made in Canberra will determine how the country prepares for a conflict that is expanding faster than its defenses. Canberra itself is not yet the city it will become. Purpose-built to serve as a capital, it is administrative rather than industrial, spread across open land and surrounded by hills that give a city both protection and isolation. Its airfield, RAF Station Canberra, also known as Fairbairn, is functional, not sophisticated. It is designed for military utility, not for high-volume or all-weather operations. On the morning of the 13th of August 1940, a Royal Australian Air Force Hudson transport departs RAF Base Laverton near Melbourne. The flight's purpose is routine by wartime standards, to carry senior government and military officials to Canberra for meetings critical to Australia's war effort. Aboard the aircraft are 6 passengers and 4 crew. Among the passengers are 3 senior ministers of the Australian government, including the Chief of the General Staff, General Sir Broodnell White. Their presence underscores the urgency of the mission. Rail travel between Melbourne and Canberra is slow and indirect. Air transport, though still evolving, offers speed and efficiency at a moment when time is considered a strategic asset. The aircraft itself, the Lockheed Hudson, represents a modern solution to wartime transport needs. Derived from a civilian airliner, it has been adapted for maritime patrol, reconnaissance, and transport duties. The Hudson is Fastwood class, relatively well-equipped, and increasingly relied upon by the RAF in 1940. It bridges an era, caught between the navigational simplicity of early aviation and the technical sophistication that will follow later in the war. Yet this reliance places pressure on systems that are still immature. Navigation in 1940 is a hybrid practice. Pilots combine dead reckoning, visual reference, basic radio direction finding, and experience. There are no standardized instrument approach procedures as they exist today. Terrain clearance relies heavily on judgment and local knowledge. Weather forecasting is improving, but localized conditions, particularly around hilly terrain, remain difficult to predict with precision. Canberra's geography complicates this further. The city sits in a basin, surrounded on multiple sides by rising ground. Approaches from the west require careful altitude management, especially in low cloud. The airfield itself has limited navigational aids, sufficient for fair weather operations but marginal when visibility deteriorates. In 1940, this is considered acceptable. Many military airfields operate under similar constraints. The crew assigned to the flight are experienced within the standards of the day. They are accustomed to operating in variable conditions, often with minimal support. Wartime flying encourages confidence and efficiency, sometimes at the expense of conservatism. Missions must be completed. Delays are tolerated, but rarely welcomed. There is no indication before departure that the flight is exceptional or high risk. Weather en route is reported as mixed but manageable. The Hudson departs Lavertoon without incident and proceeds northward toward Canberra. As the aircraft nears its destination, conditions begin to degrade. Low cloud forms over the surrounding hills. Visibility becomes inconsistent. From above, the basin that normally signals safe arrival is obscured. What remains visible are ridgelines and rising terrain, features that require precise altitude control to avoid. This is not an unfamiliar scenario for 1940 aircrew. It is, however, one that demands caution. The flight continues. No diversion is ordered. No holding pattern is established. The aircraft descends toward Canberra, following a profile that, under clearer conditions, would be routine. The broader context matters here. Wartime urgency, evolving aviation standards, and an airfield not designed for poor weather precision all converge on this approach. None of these elements alone would guarantee disaster. Together, they quietly narrow the margin for error. By the time the Hudson begins its final descent, the outcome of the flight will depend less on intent or competence and more on whether the systems and assumptions of 1940 aviation can cope with terrain they cannot clearly see. They will not. The Canberra Air Disaster cannot be understood through a single failure. It emerges instead from the interaction of an aircraft designed for speed rather than terrain clearance, a crew operating within the accepted practices of their time, an environment that conceals its hazards, and a system that offers little margin when visibility is lost. Each element functions as intended. Together, they converge toward an outcome no one aboard can see coming. The aircraft, the Lockheed Hudson, is a product of late 1930s aviation thinking. Derived from the Lockheed Model 14 Super Electra, it is a twin-engine, all-metal aircraft designed to balance performance, range, and versatility. By 1940, the Hudson has become one of the RAF's most important multi-role platforms. It is fast for its size. It climbs well. It carries modern variable pitch propellers and retractable landing gear. Compared to earlier military transports, it feels advanced. It is not, however, forgiving. The Hudson's wing design favors cruise efficiency over low-speed lift margins. On approach, particularly in turbulent or obscure conditions, it demands precise airspeed control. Excess drag or mismanaged power can quickly erode performance. There is little tolerance for steep descent profiles close to terrain. The cockpit instrumentation reflects the era. Altimeters, airspeed indicators, and basic gyroscopic instruments are present, but they provide no awareness of terrain proximity. Altitude is referenced to sea level. In hilly regions, that figure can mislead pilots into believing they have clearance they do not. The aircraft has no autopilot capable of maintaining a stabilized instrument approach. Flying the Hudson in cloud requires continuous attention and discipline. It can be done, but it leaves little room for distraction or misinterpretation. The crew. The Hudson is flown by RAF crew trained under wartime pressures. These pilots are competent, experienced, and accustomed to responsibility. They operate in an environment where missions are frequent and margins are routinely tested. In 1940, cockpit culture emphasizes authority and decisiveness. The captain's judgment is rarely challenged directly. Crew resource management, as it will later be defined, does not yet exist as a formal concept. Communication occurs, but hierarchies are clear. There is no evidence of recklessness on this flight. The crew follows a descent profile consistent with prevailing practice. They expect visual contact with the ground before terrain becomes a threat. This expectation matters. When that visual reference fails to materialize, the crew is left to reconcile instruments that show adequate altitude with a view outside that offers little confirmation. The longer this persists, the more difficult it becomes to recognize how close the aircraft is to danger. The environment. Canberra's surrounding terrain is deceptive. The hills west of the city rise unevenly, creating false horizons and gradual elevation changes that are difficult to judge from the air, especially in cloud. On the 13th of August, 1940, weather conditions unstable. Low cloud drapes itself across ridgelines, breaking intermittently. Visibility improves briefly, then deteriorates without warning. From the cockpit, the landscape appears fragmented, never fully revealed. This is a classic control flight into terrain environment. There is no dramatic storm, no violent turbulence. Instead, the danger lies in partial visibility, enough to suggest safety, not enough to confirm it. In such conditions, pilots often rely on familiarity and expectation. Terrain that is normally obvious becomes abstract. Altitude readings feel reassuring. The sense of descent becomes muted. By the time the aircraft emerges briefly from cloud, the hills are closer than anticipated. The systems. The final angle is the most consequential, not because it fails, but because it does not yet exist. In 1940, there is no standardized instrument approach into Canberra. No defined minimum descent altitudes tied to terrain clearance. No vertical guidance. No approach lighting system to anchor the final descent. Radio navigation aids are limited. Direction finding can point the aircraft toward the airfield, but it cannot tell the crew how high they must remain until visual contact is established. The responsibility for terrain clearance rests almost entirely with the pilot. This is accepted practice. It is not negligence. It is the system as designed. But when weather closes in and visibility collapses, the system offers no safety net, no alert, no enforced barrier, only the assumption that pilots will see the ground in time. On this morning, that assumption will fail. Together, these angles form a narrowing corridor of possibility. The aircraft performs as built. The crew flies as trained. The environment obscures without warning. The system provides no protection when judgment becomes uncertain. The accident will not be sudden. It will be the quiet conclusion of a descent that should have been stopped, but, within the logic of 1940 aviation, was allowed to continue. The final minutes of the flight unfold without urgency. The Lockheed Hudson continues its descent toward Canberra, engine steady, attitude controlled. The crew is executing what they believe to be a normal approach into RAF Station Canberra. The aircraft position is estimated, not precisely known. In 1940, this is standard practice. Cloud remains thick over the hills. Inside the cockpit, the altimeter indicates sufficient height above sea level. There is no immediate reason to arrest the descent. The assumption, reasonable under clearer conditions, is that the aircraft will break free of cloud with enough distance to visually align with the airfield. That moment does not come. Instead, the Hudson passes through uneven cloud layers. Visibility improves briefly, then collapses again. The ground appears only in fragments. Trees and slopes flash into view and vanish. Each glimpse is too short to provide reliable orientation. The terrain beneath the aircraft is rising. The descent profile, shallow and continuous, is appropriate for a flat approach. Over hilly ground, it becomes hazardous. Without a defined minimum safe altitude or terrain clearance procedure, the crew is left to balance instrument readings against uncertain visual cues. The aircraft remains under control. There is no loss of airspeed, no stall, no abrupt maneuver that signals panic. This is not a moment of confusion. It is a moment of misplaced confidence in a descent that has not yet been challenged. As the Hudson continues forward, the hills west of Canberra rise into the aircraft's path. The cloud obscures their true height. The altimeter, referencing sea level, cannot warn of the narrowing gap between aircraft and ground. At some point in these final seconds, the crew likely becomes aware of terrain ahead. The available evidence suggests the recognition is late. There is little time left to convert awareness into action. Power is applied. The engines respond, but physics is indifferent to intent. The aircraft is heavy, close to the ground, and committed to a flight path with minimal escape margin. The climb performance available in that moment is insufficient to clear the rising terrain. The Hudson strikes the hillside near Mount Ainslie, just short of Canberra. The impact is severe and unsurvivable. The aircraft disintegrates on contact. Fuel ignites almost immediately. There is no prolonged wreckage trail, no secondary collision. The accident is contained in a single, devastating moment. All 10 occupants are killed. There is no distress call, no final transmission. The crash occurs out of sight of the airfield, hidden by cloud and terrain. For a time, the aircraft simply fails to arrive. The absence is noticed before the cause is understood. When the wreckage is eventually located, it confirms what the flight path already suggests: a controlled aircraft flown into terrain that was unseen until it was too late. This is a defining characteristic of the Canberra Air Disaster. Not mechanical failure, not reckless flying, not weather as an active force. It is a quiet failure of awareness in an environment where awareness is everything. The first indication that something is wrong comes not from wreckage, but from absence. The Hudson does not arrive. At RAF Station Canberra, there is no dramatic alarm. Flights in 1940 operate with flexibility. Weather delays are common. Radio contact is intermittent. But as time passes, concern begins to replace routine expectation. Search efforts are initiated. Visibility remains poor. Cloud still clings to the surrounding hills, limiting aerial reconnaissance. Ground search parties move slowly through rugged terrain made more difficult by weather and dense forest. It is not until later that day that the wreckage is located on the slopes west of the city. The discovery confirms the scale of the loss. All 10 occupants are dead. Among them are 3 senior government ministers and General Sir Broodnell White, the Chief of the General Staff. The impact on Australia's political and military leadership is immediate. In a nation already mobilizing for war, the sudden loss of experienced leadership creates both operational disruption and public shock. The crash site itself offers few answers beyond the obvious. The aircraft is destroyed on impact. Fires consume much of the structure. Instrument readings, control positions, and detailed mechanical evidence are largely unrecoverable. There are no flight recorders, no cockpit voice recordings. The investigation will rely on physical fragments, witness accounts, and reconstruction of the flight's final path. A formal inquiry is convened under military authority. Investigators begin by eliminating mechanical failure. Engine components show no signs of pre-impact malfunction. Control surfaces, where identifiable, indicate the aircraft was structurally intact until collision. There is no evidence of sabotage or structural defect. Attention shifts to the approach. The inquiry reconstructs the likely descent profile based on known procedures, aircraft performance, and terrain. Weather reports are examined. Testimony from airfield personnel and meteorological staff confirms low cloud and variable visibility over the hills west of Canberra. The conclusion begins to take shape. The Hudson was under control. The crew was attempting to land. The aircraft descended below a safe altitude in conditions that obscured terrain. With insufficient visual reference and no procedural barrier to prevent further descent, the aircraft struck rising ground. The official findings reflect the language of the era: measured, indirect, cautious. There is no assignment of blame in modern terms. The crew is not criticized for recklessness. Instead, the accident is framed as a result of adverse weather and loss of visual reference during approach. What is left unsaid is just as important. There is little discussion of systemic safeguards because few exist to evaluate. Terrain clearance procedures are informal. Instrument approach standards are not yet codified. The limitations of the system are accepted as an unavoidable reality of contemporary aviation. Public reaction, however, is immediate and emotional. The deaths of senior ministers provoke national mourning. Newspapers focus on the human cost rather than the technical cause. The aircraft accident becomes a symbol of wartime vulnerability, a reminder that loss is not confined to distant battlefields. Behind the scenes, the RAF absorbs the implications more quietly. Transport flights carrying senior officials continue, but with increased caution. Informal changes begin to appear. Greater reluctance to descend in poor visibility, heightened respect for terrain near Canberra, and growing awareness that existing practices leave too little margin for error. The investigation does not produce sweeping reform overnight, but it does leave a mark. The Canberra Air Disaster exposes a gap between what aircraft can do and what procedures assume they can do. It reveals how easily controlled flight can become fatal when systems rely too heavily on visual confirmation that may never come. The impact of the crash extends beyond those lost on the hillside. It alters how risk is perceived. Subtly at first, then more deliberately as the war accelerates and aviation is forced to mature faster than it ever had before. The Canberra Air Disaster does not end with an investigation report. Its influence unfolds slowly, embedded in the evolution of military aviation practices rather than announced through sweeping reform. In 1940, air safety does not yet move at the pace of catastrophe. It advances through accumulation of lessons, of caution, of recognition that modern aircraft outpace in the systems meant to protect them. This accident becomes part of that accumulation. In the months and years that follow, the Royal Australian Air Force continues to expand rapidly under wartime pressure. Aircraft grow faster, heavier, and more capable. At the same time, it becomes increasingly clear that reliance on visual approaches into terrain-surrounded airfields carries unacceptable risk. Canberra, in particular, demands attention. Approach procedures into the capital are treated with greater conservatism. Informal altitude restrictions become more explicit. Pilots are encouraged to delay descent until visual conditions are unquestionably sufficient, though still lacking precision guidance. Crews begin to internalize the idea that not landing is often the safest decision available. This shift is cultural as much as procedural. The Canberra crash reinforces a growing awareness that controlled flight into terrain is not a failure of skill, but a failure of protection. Experienced crews, flying serviceable aircraft, can still be caught by geography and weather when systems offer no warning and no enforced boundary. Over time, this understanding will shape the development of standardized approach procedures, minimum descent altitudes, and terrain clearance criteria. These concepts will not emerge fully until later decades, but their necessity is reinforced by accidents like this one. The loss of senior leadership also alters how air transport is perceived within government. The assumption that speed justifies risk is quietly questioned. Redundancy, weather minima, and operational restraint begin to carry more weight in planning decisions, particularly when the passengers are irreplaceable. Technologically, the legacy is indirect but real. As the war progresses, navigation aids improve. Radio beacons become more reliable. Instrument training expands. The idea that aircraft should be able to approach and land without visual reference, safely and predictably, gains momentum. None of these advances can undo what happened on the hillside west of Canberra, but they ensure that similar descents, in similar conditions, are less likely to end the same way. The Canberra Air Disaster remains one of Australia's most consequential aviation accidents, not because of spectacle, but because of what it reveals. It shows how quietly disaster can unfold when confidence outpaces capability, how an aircraft can be fully under control and still be fatally misplaced. There is no final warning in this story, no dramatic failure, only a descent that should have stopped and a system that did not require it to. Today, aircraft approaching Canberra follow defined paths, guided by instruments that continuously measure terrain, position, and descent profile. Warnings sound when margins erode. Procedures intervene where judgment alone once stood. These safeguards are the true memorial. They are built not from heroism, but from restraint, from acknowledging that even skilled crews need boundaries they cannot cross unknowingly. On a winter morning in 1940, those boundaries did not yet exist. Afterward, slowly and deliberately, aviation began to draw them.